go back. From Thursday, talking about the mints.
Oh, okay.
Because it's getting changed.
Okay, yes.
So.
That was easy.
You're in my prayer.
Everybody can see the board. All right, I'm going to start a little early this morning. I've got a lot to cover, and I want to get it there and get going. I've been talking about this kind of history outline and stuff like that. You guys encouraged me to work on it some more, flesh it out a little bit more. Well, okay, that's what I've been doing, and it's a project. These are just the first couple of pages. Looks like it's going to be about 320, 25 dates, something like that. So let me just explain a few things. If you look at the top sheet, it says many of the events before the time of Christ are without month and day, as specific days of these events cannot be ascertained with clear certainty. In addition, there are as many as 5 different chronologies for events in the ancient Middle East up to the time of the founding of Rome, and with variations of plus or minus 150 years, or in some cases much more. Sometimes the differences could be 200 or 300 years. Basically, there are these 5 dates. There is what's called the middle chronology. Then there's early and ultra early, going one way, and then late and ultra late going the other way. And by late, they mean closer to the birth of Christ. Okay? So just to give you an example, the Exodus. We believe the Exodus took place in the latter part of the 1400s before Christ. The earliest date is about 1492. The latest date is about 1440, something, 45. So about 50-year range in there. But both of those are considered to be early dates. In other words, they're further away from the birth of Christ, or they're further away from 1 BC or 1 AD. Right? Modern scientists, historians, archaeologists prefer a 13th century Exodus, which means the Exodus would have taken place in 1290 something up to about 1340. So 200 years difference. Okay? That is called a late date. Okay? So early date, 1500 Exodus. Late date, 1300. Later dates are more unaccepting of biblical timeline. Okay? So when you see a chronology and you're looking stuff up in the encyclopedia or Wikipedia or whatever, and you see a late date given, that's usually from critics of the Bible. People who do not accept the Bible as it presents them, as it presents history. If you see an early date that is further away from Jesus, that tends to be people who accept the Bible timeline and accept what the Bible says about historical figures. So that's the first thing you need to know. So there's 5 chronologies, right? That makes picking dates very, very problematic in those years before the founding of Rome. The reason I say the founding of Rome is because that's really the first date that everybody agrees on. It's probably incorrect, by the way, and everybody agrees that too. But at least they agree on it. At least they say, well, everybody's going to just use that. No matter whether you're late or middle or early or whatever, we're just going to use that. When you see that, we're just going to use it. And we're not going to argue about it anymore because it's not worth it. Now, after that, there's also some dates that they're unsure of. And so there again, you're going to see differences if you compare what I've got here with some sites on the internet or whatever. Right? So it's just very difficult until you get a couple hundred years before Christ, in the maybe 300s, 200s, it gets a little easier. And then after the birth of Christ, the first couple hundred years are a little difficult. And then once you get into the 300s, 400s, 500s, then the dates become much more exact. So when you're talking history and you're talking dates, always remember that if you're talking ancient ones, way back when, you always got to have a little bit of wiggle room. And the only reason I give precise years, and in some cases days and months, is because I am convinced that that is as close as we can get. Right? Let's just look a little bit at these first 3 pages. So another thing I've done, when I am real sure, when I am pretty much convinced that the day and the month, or sometimes just the month and the year are right on, I'll underline it and put it in bold. That means those are pretty reliable dates. The other thing I've done is in the middle, in italics, and underlined in bold, I put biblical events. So this is a secular list. It is a list of secular history in most cases, but I put biblical events in there to help you see where the biblical events fit in real history. There are some cases that I put a biblical event in the secular history because it is recognized by secular historians as an important event. But there's not too many of those. So for example, I put the creation of the universe first, of course. And the date I use is a commonly accepted date by conservative Christians, 4004. Most Christian, even very conservative Bible-believing ones, aren't agreed on a month and a day. So I didn't put that in there. But they are agreed pretty much on the year. And this is, you arrive at this year through a very long, complicated study of the genealogies of Genesis 5. If you look at those genealogies and play with the years in between people and such and so, and it's a big long formula, and you work it out, this is what you arrive at. And the reason it's 4 instead of 4,000 even, that has to do with the birth of Jesus, which is at the end of this series of pages. I mean, not this series, but I think it's page 10, I think. So, for example, I put down 3150, Pharaoh Menes unites Upper and Lower Egypt into one nation. He was also known in history as Narmer. You'll see that this is before the flood. That is because most of the archaeologists and experts who study ancient world history have given this date. Now, it's very possible that this guy could have existed before the flood. I don't happen to think so, but I use this date because it's the commonly accepted date. And then 2900, the work of the Great Pyramid begins. That's also pretty commonly accepted. Now, it is becoming more and more acceptable in non-biblical circles or non-Christian circles, the people who believe in at least a local flood or a large flood, localized, maybe just a Mediterranean area. A lot of them have come to the conclusion that it is quite probable that the pyramids and Sphinx are survivors from that pre-Diluvian time, pre-flood time. Many Christian scholars, too, have come to the conclusion that those giant monuments are pre-flood monuments. I don't know myself. I haven't come to a conclusion one way or another. I think it's very likely. The only explanation I can come up with for moving those large, huge blocks, because every attempt by engineers and archaeologists to replicate the building of the Great Pyramid has failed. They have tools available to the Egyptians of the time, log rollers, ropes, physical strength, pulleys, levers, various other early, what do they call it? What machines? What's the word for it? Simple machines? Is that the word? Yeah. Simple machines. With the simple machines the Egyptians had, they have tried everything they could think of, ramps and all kinds of things to reconstruct how the pyramids were built, and every single one of them has failed miserably. In other words, they can't replicate how the Egyptians, even with 5,000 guys pulling at one time, 15,000 guys pulling at one time, and all that, they cannot replicate that. So to me, the only thing that makes sense is that those were built at a time when people had different abilities, both mental abilities and physical abilities. And we know that the people before the flood were living 800, 900 years. And we were pretty confident that they had massive mental abilities and massive physical abilities. And so that's the only thing I can think of, is that those things predate the flood. But again, that's a little bit of conjecture. But that's where I put the Great Flood at 2348. And again, that's using Genesis 5. That's using Genesis 5. Yes, sir.
Isn't pre-flood when the Nephilim were here too?
Yes. Yes.
So they could have helped.
Right. So then after that, we've got Sargon, and he predates, we think, Nimrod by just a little bit. We got the Tower of Babel, as you see there, how it fits. God calls Abram to the Promised Land, 1921, years before Christ. 1894, Babylonian dynasty. 60 years after that, Joseph rises to power in Egypt, becomes the prime minister. You see the Code of Hammurabi, 1754. The Asiatic invasion of Egypt, the Hyksos, or Hyksos, some people pronounce it one way, some the other, invaded, control Egypt. The Hittites sacked Babylon. That's a pretty well-recognized year. Hyksos expelled and explains the rise of kings who did not know Joseph. So when the Hyksos came into Egypt, they displaced the king who had used Joseph as prime minister. They also, and his dynasty, his family, they also displaced the people who were very friendly to the Jews. The Hyksos, we think, were somewhat they were Palestinian, or they were from the area of the world that the Jews were also from, that is the Fertile Crescent. Okay? So it is believed, even by good Egyptologists, that the Hyksos and the Jews that were living in the land of Goshen, the delta of the Nile, became good friends, even though the Hyksos did not use Jews in the same way that Joseph was used, for example, but they became good friends. When the Hyksos were thrown out, the native Egyptians who rose back up and who took over their native country, they were suspicious of the Jews because the Jews were the same race. They were Semites. They were the same race as the Hyksos, as opposed to being Hamites, which was the race of the Egyptians. Okay, so this would explain the biblical account of how a king rose who did not know Joseph. That is, really not, he knew he existed, but did not favor Joseph and started to persecute the Jews. This makes perfect sense. This fits into secular history very nicely. Okay? So that's the other thing I tried to do whenever possible. I tried to put the biblical timeline and the secular timeline together in a way that explains each other as best I could. So then we have, somewhat after that, the birth of Moses. Thothmes the second begins his reign with Hatshepsut as his queen. Hatshepsut is the queen that raises Moses from manhood. This explains a lot of things too. This also explains why the body of Hatshepsut has never been found. Her final resting place has never been found. her tomb that she built for herself when she was queen and pharaoh was defaced and destroyed by her successors. And that would explain it if Josephus, for example, is right, and Hatshepsut left Egypt with the Jews in the Exodus, and was seen therefore as a traitor. This would explain why all her figures are decapitated in Egypt in ancient times. All of her names, where her name is written into an inscription, it is crossed out, and her tomb is abandoned. Yes, sir.
If you ever go to Egypt, they'll even point it out where they didn't cross out, they chipped it out.
Chipped it out,
There's
yes.
a big blank there.
Yeah, yeah. So this is, and she is not the only pharaoh, but the only woman, only queen that was ever done to. And so that fits again the biblical narrative. A date that I am confident is accurate is April 16 April 1457. Thutmose III wins the Battle of Megiddo, Armageddon. I thought it would be kind of fun for you to know when the original Battle of Armageddon was. And then 1446, the Hebrews' exodus from Egypt. This again is according to biblical chronology. This is using various other passages in the Bible and other references to secular kings of other nations to work back and come up with this date. So it's pretty accurate, I would think. Again, if you want to push it 50 years one way, you can push it 50 years earlier. I don't think you can push it 50 years later. So you could push it back to the 1490s, and that would be fine, I think, but not earlier than that. Conquest of Canaan then would be 40 years after the Exodus, of course, so that would be about 1405. I also divided this up into parts to make it a little bit easier for us to go with. So from creation to the Exodus is part one. You know, there's a lot of years in there. I don't pick very many of them. It gets easier and easier to pick years and dates and events as we get closer and closer to modern times. So there's a few more from the conquest of Canaan to the Babylonian captivity. So that's the entire time that the nation of Israel is in possession of the land of Israel. That's part two, that whole time. So from the time of Joshua to the time of the destruction of the first temple. So first of all, you've got the time of Judges. The time of Judges was a very long time. You don't get that impression from the book of Judges. The book of Judges gives you an impression that it was just one judge after another, and bingo, was done. But when you look at the dating and you look at other things that's going on in the world, it's very clear that the time of the Judges was that long period of time, of 250 years at least, maybe more. I put in a few of the things, and the one that I keyed in on first was Amenhotep IV, which is Akhenaten. Now, Akhenaten is important in the history of world religion. He's also important in the history of Egypt. He's also important in many other ways. Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten, begins his reign, and he attempts to get rid of all Egyptian gods except one, Aten. Okay. And so he calls Aten the god of the shining sun, not the sun itself. This is a very often a misconstruction or misunderstanding on the part of lay people. A lot of people think that what Akhenaten tried to do is make the sun god the chief god. That's not true. The sun god is Ra. Okay? But the light that the sun gives off is a separate god in the Egyptian pantheon. That's Aten. And so what Akhenaten wanted to do was get away from physicality. He wanted to get away from gods that were birds or jackals or crocodiles, that kind of thing. Moon, sun, stars, that kind of thing. He wanted to get away from them. And so he wanted a god who did not have a physical body or a physical shape. Okay? He wanted a god that was basically God is sunshine. You could call him the first hippie. Okay? So sunshine is, the first his god. He moves the capital to the new city Akhtaten, which means the horizon of Aten. Very soon after that, his city is abandoned by another very famous Egyptian king, and the most famous thing he did was undo what his father did. So you notice their names, okay? Akhenaten. So he is a follower of Aten. Very often the pharaohs, their last names or their names at the end of the names, you can tell which god that they favor. Well, notice King Tut's name, Tutankhamen. Amen. So he favored not Aten, but Amen, which was a different god. So he went back. The most famous thing King Tut did was be found in one piece. That is, his tomb was found in one piece. Other than that, he was a forgettable pharaoh. He only reigned a very few years. But you can say that during his reign, he did one very important thing. And that was he changed the religion of Egypt from one god back to many gods. That's a big deal. In many ways, people feel that he was assassinated by followers of his father because he didn't. Next, you see Ramses. He's the one who's portrayed in the movie The Ten Commandments. That's the Ramses, the Yul Brynner character. That's who that is, Ramses II. He had the longest reign of a pharaoh, 75 years. And he defeats the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, which basically turns the entire Middle East over to Egypt. So a really important event. A couple other things I'll point out. I'm not going to talk about every single one of them. Fall of Troy, the end of the Trojan War. That's a fairly recognizable date. Again, not a day and a month, but a year. That's pretty recognizable. 1050, Samuel anoints Saul and Benjamin as the first king of united Israel. I should have put that in italics in the middle because that is not recognized by any secular historian. I'll have to change that. Most secular historians do recognize David. They admit that David existed. And 1010 as his year of becoming king is fairly well recognized. This also within Solomon dedicates the first temple. Very important point. Matter of fact, the Bible makes such a big point of this that most of the dates in the Bible can be reckoned from the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem. And you can check that out in 1 Kings chapter 6. And many of the other references in the Bible will say, so many years before the temple was dedicated, or so many years after the temple was dedicated. And then later when the temple was destroyed, they will say, so many years after the temple was destroyed. And then when the temple was rebuilt, same thing. So the Jews and God in His Word and the prophets use the temple very often as a marking point to differentiate historical times. So it helps us a lot because even the secular historians, many if not most of them, will agree with those kinds of dates. This one's kind of fun. The next one I just put in for fun. Libyan Pharaoh, that is a pharaoh that came from far to the west of Egypt, invades Israel, sacks Jerusalem, carries away many treasures from the temple, including the Ark of the Covenant. This is the reference that Indiana Jones makes when he's talking about the Ark of the Covenant being captured by the Egyptians and taken back to the Well of Souls. As far as I know, there was no Well of Souls, but there was a treasure city called Tanis. That is a fact. The treasure city of Tanis did exist. And it did have a lot of spiritual significance, and it did have, and it was a place where many religious artifacts were taken. Let's see. Let's skip down. Let me skip down to the 885 because I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to be doing in the next days, and I'm going to be following. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm following a trajectory that does a couple of things. First, it follows the prophecies of Daniel. You remember the prophecies of Daniel with the four kingdoms? Okay? and the king with the little horn, and all that stuff, and one like a lion, and a leopard, and a bear, and that. So I'm trying to follow Daniel's prophecies a little bit. I'm also trying to follow the flow of Western history. There will be some dates in India and China, but that's only because those dates affect the West. But I'm trying to follow Western history because we are in the West, obviously. And the culmination of Western history is really the expansion into the New World in where we live. So that's what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to be following Persia, Babylon, Greece then later, and then Rome, of course, and then after Rome, other empires and such. So, for example, the laws of Lycurgus establish a military-oriented reformation of Spartan society in accordance with the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. All his reforms promoted three Spartan virtues: equality among citizens, military fitness, and austerity. You will not believe it, but if you dig into history, you will find that Sparta, famous for its energy, famous for its fighters, and famous for a lot of things, was a pit before Lycurgus. It was a disaster. It was an economic disaster. It was a quarreling bunch of petty little fiefdoms and little tribal leaders. It was a mess. This guy was the guy who turned Sparta into a lean, mean fighting machine. Really, he is the guy who did it. And so Sparta is going to figure prominently in the future Greek Empire. And so that's why I put this in here. And that's what I'm going to be doing. Yes, sir.
Just by reading this, it looks like Trump was a Spartan.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure he would agree with that. The next two dates I want to talk about real quick are 776, the first Olympiad, and 753, 21 April. 776 is agreed by almost every historian everywhere as the first Olympic Games. I could not find a month and a day, except some say fall, some say spring, but I could not get an agreement on that. 776, and I was going to use that as the first date everybody agrees on. But I found that the next date, the founding of the city of Rome, is accepted by 1,000% of historians. I don't care how cynical you are. You could be the most questioning, pain in the butt historian ever known to the human race, and you would still say, yeah, fine, that's the founding of the city of Rome. Most of them just agree to it because it's been there forever. And it is the date that the Roman Empire used for its entire history. So in the time of Christ, Christ was born not, 1 AD. Christ was born so many years after the founding of Rome. So the founding of Rome is the preeminent date in the entire history of the ancient world. And so you can put a star next to it or however, but that's a date that nobody argues. Even down to the day and the month. Nobody argues. 1,000% agreement. And that's the first one in this list that I can say that. The lost 10 tribes you see there, Sennacherib, I won't bring into him right now. Let's go to 605, very important date. 605, May, June, early summer. Nebuchadnezzar wins the Battle of Carchemish, secures Babylon control over most of the Middle East. This was like the Egyptian victory at Kadesh centuries before. This means Babylon is the big kahuna. Babylon is it. Babylon is the one and only superpower after this battle. And of course, this leads then to the fall of Jerusalem. This is also very well attested. The Jews have a day that they know this happened, but because it's a Jewish calendar, and the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, so it moves all over the place, you can't tie it down to an August or September day. It's in that area of August, mid-August to mid-September. Or even early August, I guess. Most of the references I saw like to use August 8th. That was a kind of favorite one, and other Jews like to use a date in September, around the 15th, 14th or 15th. But you're not going to get a lot of agreement. So you can just say August, September, 586. 586 agreed by everybody. Again, secular and religious. Part 3. I didn't get much of that done. I got stuck. I'll tell you where in a minute. But Solon's laws, very important because, again, Athens was a mess. Athens was a backwater. Athens was nothing until Solon come along. Solon comes along and he does for Athens what Lycurgus does for Sparta. And then another guy, much like those guys, a guy named Servius Tullius, he starts to do the same thing for Rome. Rome was conquered and ruled over by the Etruscans for about 300 years. And they were slaves. They were nothing. Until Servius Tullius comes along. He comes along, he deposes the last king of Rome, and he begins reform. He does the first census about actually counting heads in Rome. This is the first time anybody ever did that anywhere. Nobody ever did that before. He's the first guy that did a census anywhere, as far as we know. And he's the first guy to have a standing army. Even the Spartans, didn't have a standing army. Okay. The Spartans, you would go home, hang up your shield and your spear, and be called out like a militia. Servius Tullius made a standing army, and people actually barracks and ready to fight 365 days a year. Kurt, you got a question?
Did Moses do a census?
Yeah, Moses did a census, but remember, all the censuses in the Bible have a little bit of an issue, a little bit of a problem. They only counted men. They very often only counted men of battle age. This was a census of every man, woman, and child in Rome. And it was done for the same reason we do our censuses today. Since it is for representation. So representative Republican democracy began. Well, yeah, it really began here for all intents and purposes. Now, here I put the birth of Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. This is recognized by all Buddhists and most other secular historians, 8 April. 551, 28 September, birth of Kong Fuzi. And you can put a dash sometimes between FU and ZE, because ZI, because it depends on which Chinese characters you're using. But his name was not Confucius. Believe it or not. No Chinaman, no Chinese would ever say, I follow Confucius. They would always say, I follow Confuci. Because the word Confucius is a made-up word. And it was made up by the Jesuits, who were popular in doing that kind of thing. Never heard of making up words. Jesuits were early into China in the 15 and 1600s, and when they came across this very popular philosopher, Confuci, either they couldn't say his name or they didn't like it, and so they changed it to Confucius. And the story was that they changed it to Confucius because they found him confusing. It's as simple as that. I don't know that story is true, but you hear it very commonly. Yes?
Well, it pretty much sounds like they tried to spell his name phonetically.
Maybe. Yeah.
You see, you're Confucius, so it's like, yeah, whatever. And they murdered our last name.
You've got Cyrus coming to power. Cyrus is important because he was predicted in the book of Isaiah. And he is the one who allows the Jews to return to Palestine. So he is an important character. Darius, or Darius, depends. Some historians say one way, some pronounce it the other way. He is proclaimed king of Persia, and he allows the temple to be reconstructed and the walls of Jerusalem to be rebuilt. In 509, the last king of Rome after Tullius, is overthrown and the republic is established. One of the things that took me a long time was to figure out this timeline here. This is very difficult because the histories of Rome were written centuries after the fact, and the different historians didn't always agree. And the historians that we get today are more than 2,000 years old, so it's very hard to follow. Themistocles, very important guy. Themistocles is the guy who, and I didn't have room to put this in here, I tried not to take up a lot of room here. Themistocles is the guy who is credited with founding the Athenian navy. And it is the Athenian navy, not their army, but their navy that wins the great battles against the Persians. And so without Themistocles and his navy and building a massive fleet, we would be speaking Persian today. So, probably. So the Battle of Marathon, there you got, and that was a defeat. Again, remember, the Greeks lost the Battle of Marathon. Xerxes the First, and his queen, one of his queens was Esther. Most historians do not accept the story of Esther. Most secular historians, they think it's a fable put in the Bible for Jewish political reasons. But of course we accept it, and that's why I put the comment in there. August, September, the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. Remember also that the Spartans lost the Battle of Thermopylae and were wiped out to a man. This opened the floodgates for the Persians to pour into southern Greece, and they sacked and burned Athens. Matter of fact, they sacked and burned a whole bunch of Greek cities. So the battle of the 300 Spartans was a huge defeat. Remember that. It might be looked upon as heroic, but they still lost. Whether or not they actually accomplished anything is hard to argue one way or another. Yeah, they held up the Persians for a couple weeks. Did it really make a difference for Athens? No, Athens still wasn't able to defend themselves. Athens was still destroyed. And Xerxes and his army made it all the way to the south, the southern tip of Greece. Because there were no Spartans left to defend Sparta, which is on the Peloponnese, which is that finger-looking thing sticking down below that. It may be heresy to say, but the loss of the 300 Spartans was absolutely no big deal in history. They probably would have been smarter. Instead of stopping at Thermopylae, they probably would have been smarter to go west and be on the other side of Athens with the rest of the Greek army, and that could have prevented more damage. But they decided to go up to Thermopylae, and okay, that's what happened. It does slow the Persians' advance. The Athenians did get away with some of their treasure. They take away some of their literature and things like that got out of town, so I guess you could say that's a good thing. But then Salamis was a victory, again by a fleet. It's a naval battle. And then finally there was the Battle of Plataea that ends the Persian threat. That was a total wipeout. The Athenian ships destroyed the vast majority of the Persian fleet, and with now the fleet to protect them, the Persians retreated back into Persia and never really made a successful invasion of Greece ever again. The Delian League is I spent an awful lot of time on this because it is important, and I'll tell you why it's important. The last comment there. This is the first major political military alliance where the most powerful entity, and there's 14 or 15, 17 maybe other little nations can join. And the most powerful one at that time was Athens, Sparta being the second most. But the deal was, if you were in this league, you agreed to protect the weakest one. That had never been done before. Most of the alliances before this had been alliances between equals. Two equal powers would join or at least make a treaty saying they're not going to kill each other. This is the first time we recognize in history that a very major, you could say superpower, formed an alliance, league, and said, if somebody attacks the tiniest little island in this alliance, we, the big guys, will come to their defense. That is, as I say here, this is the basis for all alliances today. This is the basis for NATO and all the ones like it. If Iceland is attacked, we promise to fight as though it was Arizona that was attacked. That's NATO. Now, I don't know, SEATO is no longer in existence, but I think there's something that replaced it. I don't know what it's called. But all the alliances after the Second World War, the big one, there was many of them. They were all based on the Delian League, where if one is attacked, all are attacked. And all have an obligation. Which is why, and the reason it cost me so much time is because Sparta dropped out because of that. You can imagine why. Sparta says, look, if you're too weak to protect yourself, we ain't going to come save your bacon. Sparta's idea was the old idea, two powers of equal strength uniting and becoming a mighty empire. And so the Delian League literally sparked what was called the Peloponnesian War, which, by the way, Sparta won and destroyed Athens for a while. This thing is a lot more important than I thought it was. I mean, I knew about it, but I didn't really until I started doing a lot of reading, and then that's what took me so much time. That's what happens with these things. That's why I'm only on page 3. Yes, sir. Do you have a question? No. Okay. All right, let's get to the next religion that we have under consideration. The next religion under our consideration is Judaism. Oh,
No. Well, actually, yes, I do. Thank you, sorry about that.
Okay. Here I incorporated the change and numbered all paragraphs. So now if you have a question, just haul out the number, paragraph, whatever, and we'll go from there, all right? And I'll do this for the rest of the study. Okay, Judaism, the basics. First, Judaism is the oldest of the 3 major Western religions and is the forerunner of both Christianity and Islam. The history of Judaism is well known, chronicled first in the Bible and later in rabbinic literature, and is a matter of intense interest even today within contemporary Jewish studies. So Jews themselves study Judaism a lot. And as you're going to see, there are a lot of branches to Judaism, a lot of divisions in Judaism, and they study it. One of the reasons they study it is in attacking each other or arguing with each other, if you will, or debating with each other about what is real Judaism and what's not. That's a big issue. Right? Judaism reflects a certain unanimity among its various groups in terms of organization, beliefs, and requirements. In many instances, differences are a matter of degree rather than of substantial disagreement. Now, I will say that the matters of degree get infinitely small. And some of the differences are so small that it is difficult for Gentiles to comprehend. And I don't expect you to understand all the differences in these tiny groups, because they get crazy, they really do. The three largest, nevertheless, Judaism has not escaped the general differentiation within religious communities, which has become a fact of life in the modern world. So they're just as split as the Protestants ever were. The three largest groups within Judaism are the conservative, Orthodox, and Reform bodies. These three groups have generally been seen as the major Jewish denominations. Each is well organized around congregational or rabbinical associations. They have their seminaries, their colleges, they have their buildings, universities, congregations, synagogues, all that. One other group, the Reconstructionists or ultra-Orthodox Jews, have been the most successful in challenging the dominance of the three older forms of Judaism and have seen themselves as a fourth separate branch of Judaism. I would say by the time we're done, we're going to have at least 6 major branches and then a whole bunch of minor ones. We're on paragraph 5, Bruce. Within the three largest groups, there are also subdivisions, and I would say subdivisions within subdivisions. In addition, there are liberal and progressive Jews who remain outside of even the Reform structures, and there are important differences within the Orthodox community. Between those of the Middle Eastern descent, Italy and the Baltic states, plus the Khazars of Crimea, who follow the Ashkenazi rite, or Ashkenazic, okay? And those of North Africa, Moroccan, and Spanish, Portuguese descent, who follow the Sephardic or Sephardic rite. So in general, you have 2 branches of Judaism from a racial standpoint. Has nothing to do, the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic have nothing to do really in their origin with the type of way that religion is practiced. Now, it turned out that way. I mean, they are different in the way they practice, but that's not how it started. These are purely racial, cultural divisions. Depends on who your mommy was, basically. Your mommy, grandmommy, and whatever, all the way back. Arabic, Moroccan, Spanish, Portuguese, North African, or was your mommy Italian, Khazaric, French, German, Czechoslovakian, Austrian, that kind of thing. Okay. That's a huge difference, and you can even look at them and see the difference. Ashkenazic Jews look a certain way, and Sephardic Jews look a certain way. All right. 6. On either end of the spectrum are the humanistic Jews who have proposed a non-theistic form of Judaism. And then on the other far end are the Hasidic Jews who follow a mystical tradition which has its greatest flowering in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. Of the many Hasidic Jews, the Lubavitchers have the largest following. We'll talk a little bit at the end about Rebbe Lubavitch. Very, very important. And the reason that the Lubavitchers are important to us is because they are the only Jewish group that does evangelism or outreach. They actually try to convert non-Jews and non-practicing Jews. Make an effort at it. Nobody else in Judaism makes an effort at it. As a matter of fact, it was looked down upon, it was seen as crude and classless if you tried to proselytize someone as a Jew in past centuries. 7. In spite of differences within the community, Judaism has attained a relative stability within American society in terms of basic beliefs and practices. Most American Jews will be identified with the main traditions that I've mentioned so far. It is very important to understand that Judaism is a religion based on continuing revelation. That is, God continues to reveal himself here in time in various ways. At the core of this revelation is the doctrine of ethical monotheism. Okay? Ethical meaning it's based on the law. That's the most important thing you can know about this religion. It is based upon law, ethics, morals, rights and wrongs, do's and do nots, do's and don'ts. Okay? The other thing, too, here is that continuing revelation means the Bible is not closed. You would think that a group that does not accept the New Testament would not accept anything else. But that's not true. As far as the Jews are concerned, God continues to reveal himself, continues to send prophets. The problem is, of course, that one group accepts this guy as a prophet, another group accepts that guy as a prophet, not that guy, and so on and so forth. So it makes it very, 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 very difficult to decide what is and what is not Jewish theology. Yes, sir.
Sounds like it's pretty fun to dance on.
In a lot of ways it is, yes. They have fallen on the same tough times. Yeah.
That's similar to Mormonism.
Similar also to Mormonism, yes. And Jehovah's Witnesses, too. Seventh-day Adventists. The cults tend to have that problem. When you've got continuing revelation, then when you supposedly get a new revelation, it's always kind of hard to convince everybody that it's a new. It's like if we found the real 1 Corinthians. Okay, we know that Paul wrote at least 3 letters to Corinth, not 2. He wrote 3. There's no question about it. We have the last 2. We don't have the first one. But because we don't have the first one, we call the second letter 1 Corinthians and the third letter 2 Corinthians. But what if someday we find at the bottom of the Vatican Library the first letter that Paul wrote to Corinth? Especially if it has something kind of unique in there, right? And it's proven to be the letter of Paul. This is for argument's sake. How are we going to convince everybody that it really belongs in the Bible? It would be impossible, frankly. You could not get all of Christianity to agree anymore. Especially if that new thing that was in there, new teaching was in there, was. Let's say Paul said it's fine to have 7 wives, just for fun. Let's just say it. Okay? You would really have a hard time getting that into the Bible. Yeah.
If that first letter said that homosexuality was okay, probably accepted in a heartbeat.
Yeah. You're probably right about that. You're probably right about that. So at its core, the ethical monotheism would be summed up with these points. The ever-living God, infinite creator, is both transcendent and immanent. What does that mean? Transcendent means he goes beyond time and space. Immanent says he's here now. He is omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. He's everywhere. He has all power, and he knows everything. He hears prayer, and the pure in heart may commune with him directly without any intercession. Never think of a Jewish rabbi in the same way you think of a Catholic priest, a Roman priest. Roman priests are mediators. That's what a priest is. There are no priests in Judaism anymore. They know who the Levites are. The Levites are followed. Okay, they're known who they are in case they should ever have a temple again. They'll need Levites, obviously, but they don't use them as priests. Man is free and not tainted with original sin. So Jews completely deny original sin. There is no original sin. Jews are born free, like the wind, like the lion in Africa. Born free. They're born free. They can make a tablet, it's called tabula rasa, or blank slate. They can make a choice for good or for evil. Judaism affirms life as good and seeks to endow it with spiritual and moral worth. L'chaim, life. Yeah, that's good. Life is good. Even if you're a poor milkman, life is good. Hey, you get your, you got your Passover, once a week. You got a few other things you like. Poor Tevye, even though he was poor as a church mouse and everything, he was a pretty happy guy. He was pretty content now. That's a real good example, I guess you would say, of Judaism. The Jewish affirmation of faith emphasizes God's unity, and expressed is what is called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Shema Israel, Adonai Elohim, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Authoritative Jewish literature includes the Bible, what we call the Old Testament only, obviously, but also the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Midrash, the Rav Halakha, Halakha, and finally many various legal codes. And boy, there are a bunch. The most referenced and authoritative Jewish law code is the Shulchan Aruch, literally the set table, published by Rabbi Joseph Caro in Venice in 1565. To this code, which is based on Ashkenazi customs, was soon added the Halma, literally the tablecloth, of Rabbi Moses Syrians, which gives the viewpoint of Sephardic Jews. So taken together, it's now in one book. Okay? So the Shulchan Aruch is together now with the Hal Mapah. It's in one book, and this is the law code for the Jews, which is referenced many more times than the Bible in most Jewish seminaries. At its core, Judaism is extremely, I should have put that word in capital letters, extremely legalistic, and the breadth and depth of its many law codes is astonishing to non-Jews. Observant Jews, however, would say that theirs is a religion of deeds rather than creeds. And they're very proud of that, by the way. The deeds required of a Jew are both ritual and ethical, the former in relation to God, the latter in relation to one's fellow man. In conservative Judaism, the process of legal interpretation of Jewish law and ritual is vested in the law committee of the Rabbinical Assembly, which, by discussion and vote, preserves the liability and adaptability of Jewish law to contemporary life. So if you want to know, is it okay to eat gummy bears or whatever, you send it to this group. They will debate it, they will come to a conclusion, and send you the results. Or send it to your rabbi. They will tell you whether it's kosher or not to eat gummy bears, or whatever. And any other kind of law that you can think of. Ethics are inseparable from religion in Judaism, and the deepest concern of the Torah in its broadest sense is morality, both individual and social. If you ask a typical Jew, what is the most important teaching of the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah, he will tell you the law. And that's why it's called the law. That was what it was called in Jesus' day. They didn't call it the Torah yet. They called it simply the law. That's it. It's the law. The first 5 books of Moses is the law. Why? Because it has Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which contain the core of the law. Both civil law, ceremonial law, and oral. Now, of course, Jesus fulfilled the civil and ceremonial law for us, so we don't need to. Moral law he repeated for us, so we still in small that. Remember the general rule for today. The general rule for today is, if something is repeated in a command by Jesus or one of his apostles in the New Testament, that was in the Old Testament, then it is part of the moral law. If it is not repeated, in other words, if Jesus and the apostles don't say, by the way, we don't want you to eat no pigs, okay? If it's not said, then it's not part of the moral law. And so because Jesus and Paul and others, Jesus made it very clear the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Okay? He made it very clear that God no longer cared after his time what day you went to church. That was very clear. Paul made it very clear too. What kind of food you ate didn't matter to God anymore. What kind of clothes you wore didn't matter to God. How many steps you took on the Sabbath didn't matter to God, etc., etc., etc. It's very clear in the New Testament. So those things cannot be moral law. Cannot be commanded. They can't. If you want to do them, if you decide that the Jewish law or the Jewish diet is the best diet in the world, be my guest. Don't eat any more shrimp cocktails. You know? Don't eat any more lobster. Lobster are just big cockroaches anyway. You know that. Okay. So, you know, if you want to follow that diet, follow the diet. I don't care. Have more power to you. Okay? This is probably a really good diet. But don't say to somebody else, Christian, some other Christian, you have to follow that diet, otherwise you're going to go to hell. Like the Seventh Adventists over here say, if you don't go to church on Saturday, you're going to hell. Now that's just plain stupid. Yeah.
The Jews is a work religion, just like every other non-Christian religion.
You got it. That's fact. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. And you'll see that more and more as we go along here. Paragraph 12. The Sabbath, or Sabbath, is the day of rest on which all manner of work is forbidden. Other days of obligation are New Year, Rosh Hashanah, Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and the pilgrimage festivals of Tabernacles, Sukkot, Passover, Pesach, and Pentecost, Shavuot. Rosh Hashanah lasts for 2 days, Sukkot lasts for 7 days, the first 2 of which are days of obligation. While work is permitted on the intermediate days of the holiday, it is nevertheless required that all meals be eaten outside in a sukkah or a booth. Sukkot is followed immediately by Shemini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, both days of obligation. Pesach lasts for 8 days. While only the first 2 and the last 2 are days of obligation, dietary restrictions remain in force during the entire holiday. And Shavuot is observed for 2 days, both days of obligation. The festivals of Hanukkah and Purim do not constitute days of obligation, although it is required that certain religious rituals be performed. On Hanukkah, for example, it is necessary to kindle a menorah on each of the 8 nights. On Purim, it is required to hear the reading of the Megillah, or scroll of Esther. Megillah. That's the Megillah. You ever wonder what the Megillah was? You hear in New Yorkers talk about the Megillah? That's the Megillah. Within Judaism, the priestly function is not vested in any one particular individual or group. The rabbi is appointed spiritual leader who guides and represents the congregation. In addition, there are elected lay leaders both in congregation and larger Jewish community. Group worship is required. Congregational worship has led to the adoption of certain conventions, such as the Minyan, or 10 adults, who constitute the minimum number for holding public worship. Any knowledgeable Jew may conduct worship services. You do not need to be a graduate from a rabbi seminary. If you got 10 adult Jews together, that means any Jew who has been bar mitzvah. And in most Jewish circles, they have to be male. So if you get 10 men together, 10 bar mitzvah guys together, you can have a synagogue. And then you can simply elect the president of the synagogue, and you can elect the worship leader. Neither one have to be rabbis. Now then you can start calling the worship leader rabbi if you want to, or the president of the congregation the rabbi if you want to, especially if it's the same guy. But you don't have to. Group worship. Items required for formal worship are the Torah, or scroll of the law, and its accoutrements, which are prayer books, Hebrew Bibles, skull caps, and prayer shawls. In addition to providing the ark that houses the Torah and adequate storage space for the above enumerated items, the facility for worship should be in keeping with the solemn dignity of the activity of prayer. Some will tell you that they have to face Jerusalem. Other groups, it's not important. And the dietary laws constitute a sizable liturgy, beginning with the biblical prohibitions in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. These were later expanded considerably, and I do mean considerably, by rabbinic interpretation, and include, among other things, the prohibition against eating the flesh of certain animals and against the mixing of milk and meat. And again, you can have very, very austere obedience of these and very, very loose obedience. Austere obedience would be 2 complete kitchens, one for dairy, one for meat. 2 refrigerators, 2 stoves, 2 dishwashers, 2, you need 2 sets of plates, you got the whole thing, okay? On the other hand, my youngest daughter's good friend, who's Jewish, really enjoys bacon cheeseburgers. So, go figure. He only goes to synagogue once or twice a year. Anyone in the presence of a dying person may guide him in the expression of vidui, the confession, and the affirmation of faith, the Shema, but the presence of a rabbi is important both for guidance and consolation. The purpose of Jewish funeral and burial requirements is both to honor the deceased and provide comfort for mourners. The requirements include cleansing of the body, clothing the body in white linen, shrouds and prayer shawl, and the use of simple wooden coffin. And to complete the burial ritual within 24 hours. That's very, very, very important. The funeral service is simple and prescribed by Jewish law. There's a certain liturgy for it, and it is followed to the letter. Following the burial, close relatives observe a mourning period, which is normally 7 days. So, that's the basics. Okay? That's the basics. And then from there, go all over the place. You've got, for example, the Ashkenazi, the Khazari, the Sephardic Jews. After that, we have Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, Ultra-Orthodox Judaism, and Lubavitch. And then I found some very interesting information on Black Judaism. And then at the back, I've got a glossary of Jewish terms, so that when you get a cabbie in New York and are let off in the Jewish block, you can speak and be understood. So we will pick it up at paragraph 20 next time. Questions, comments? Anybody, everybody, nobody, somebody. Anybody have something from before class we didn't get to? Nope. All right, let's close. May the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be and abide with us all. Amen.